Hi everyone. Hope I'll vamp in a little in case this is getting cut off. So I am here for a really exciting chat for me. As you know, I'm Emily E.D.E. Bell. I'm a writer. Well, maybe you don't know. If you don't, I'm a writer and an editor and a human and other things. And I'm here with trying not to be, a little bit starstruck because, he's just also a cool person. But I'm here with Tad Williams to discuss fantasy and factory, and if you've watched some of the chats that we've had for our small press last week, and we have one more coming up, we've been focusing a lot on Cheryl S. and Toomey's book Songs for the Shadows and on African fiction, and it's a little more difficult sometimes being able to talk about a book where the author is deceased. And so I am extremely happy and honored to have one of these sessions dedicated, at least at the beginning, to talking about The Factory. I have a copy here, the English translation of Zavod, The Factory, by Ihor Maisak, and translated by Yevgenia Dubrova and Hanna Leliv. So I don't even know if Tad Williams needs to be introduced, but you never know who's watching this. So Tad, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, yeah, I don't know much that I can say except that I'm a writer. I'm known primarily for fantasy and science fiction. As Emily knows, though, I read very broadly and all kinds of books, and I'm looking forward to talking about The Factory very much because I enjoyed it, and it's full of interesting stuff and what we sometimes call in the business chewy bits. It's full of chewy bits. So I'm looking forward to being able to talk about it.
Yeah, maybe I should just start with, for those who aren't familiar, just the briefest of histories on the factory and how it came to be. I actually have heard Ted talking about something similar, not that I'll speak for him, but about being a fairly secular person who has found the universe to work in some very interestingly energetic and strange ways. And so I am not of Ukrainian heritage. We do have a small press. That's a whole different story, also a long story. But there was a path, if you're familiar with, we were in Canada and we were approached for this anthology called Embroidered Worlds, and one thing led to another. And it turns out that we were approached for translating this novel from Ukrainian into English. And so the book was published in Ukrainian in 2022. And it is believed to be, I can't prove it, but it was believed to be the first novel, so not a fantasy or a genre novel, but the first novel at all published after the Russian invasion in 2022. So I have been told by many people in country and out, but many Ukrainians, that the book it's not only just a book that they enjoy, it has a special meaning. It was a sign of hope, as people who love storytelling know what storytelling means to them, that said this horrific invasion is threatening our existence, our culture, but we're writing books, we're telling stories, we're living our lives. And then tragically, Ihor was killed in 2023. We were approached, I guess about a year ago, after Embroidered Worlds, to potentially translate this. And I just kind of fell in love with the premise. I refused to read the robot translation, but we had somebody that we had worked with, a translator, who described it to me and said what it was like. And I just thought, I love this author. I just know that I would get along with him. I love this work. It's different. It's not in a genre bin, as a lot of, we'll get into this later, global storytelling often isn't. And so this is coming out on Tuesday, officially, the English translation. And I think one fun story I had with it was there was someone of Ukrainian heritage at World Fantasy Convention just a month ago in Niagara Falls. And she says, yeah, she saw the book and said, yes, I know about it. I've read it. It's very good. And so I was like, no, you haven't read it. So I opened it and showed her, and she saw that it was in English. And she paused and said, oh, this is very important, because she realized, oh, I had no clue this was in English. So we also think this was the only novel translated from Ukrainian to English this calendar year.
Wow.
To my knowledge, I'm not aware of any, modern novel. There were some classics, like Ukrainian classics, that were included in the grant, but no modern novel. So I'm so happy that you read it. I waited for the human translated English beautifully, and the two translators worked back. They put lots of love into this.
Yeah, that's
Um,
obvious.
so what'd you think of The Factory?
Well, it was an amazing book. It was not what I expected in the sense of if I had expectations, um, because there is what I referred to as a MacGuffin. There's a device in it that is at some levels the main motive device for what is going on around the characters. But as you know, oftentimes was the case back even in the old days of my own genre and science fiction and stuff, the MacGuffin is not really the point. It's what it represents. It's what it means to the people. It's what the people do. There's even, without wanting to be too spoilery too early on, there's even some question as to what it really does, if anything, that runs all through the story. So that was fascinating to me. And as a writer myself, obviously those kinds of things jump out at me when I see them. But more fascinatingly for me was, if you want a comparison, although this is a very rough one, it reads a bit like some magic realism that I have read, in the sense that it is a snapshot of a society at a certain moment when things are happening, when things are changing. And you may or may not care about the MacGuffin itself, but you definitely come to care for the characters and come to watch what they do. And in that sense, it's just a book, a novel in the classic sense. You know, it's and all great novels are about people. And I really thought that that was one of the strongest things. But also, of course, and you know, I mean, slap me if this is too stupidly obvious, but it's it's really about life in general. It's about civilization. It's about how societies build themselves, and also how they dismantle themselves. Not always for the bad. In other words, this is not a book that I'm sure a lot of people would hear us talking about this and go, "Oh my God, a novel by a Ukrainian who tragically died not long after finishing it, and in the middle of a war-torn country being invaded, et cetera," and would expect something like, I don't know, Jerzy Kaczynski's The Painted Bird or something, which for those of you who haven't read it is one of the most horrifying and depressing stories about life during wartime. This is not about wartime per se, although that obviously is something that informs the texture of it. But what it's really about is people, and how people deal with things, and how people continue to change even when it seems they've gotten what they wanted. So there's a ton of really fascinating literary questions that are raised in terms of what Myshak was trying to do with the book, and what the author wanted people to feel as they were reading it and finishing it. So before I go on anymore, I'd love to hear some of what you think about that, Emily.
Yeah, no, I love that too, and I think that something we'll probably touch on a few times is um, the pushing of storytelling into these genre bins, and the fact that, you know, why are we writing? We're writing about connections, we're writing about people, we're writing about life. And one reason that you know, I thought you might connect with it actually, the way that I did was, as you say, Ihor was, I mean, a true believer in joy and in love and in the possibility of humans and of the value of, I mean, it just, in every page of the book, it's not, it has elements to it that are not, you know, all cheerful, but every moment, every conversation by this lake, sometimes sort of, you know, I mean, these characters are quirky. They're they're not like necessarily going to be your favorite people. I mean, even though you fall in love with them for different reasons, I feel like, and every moment of interaction, of pause, of celebration is a joy, and I feel like that's just one of the messages in the book. You know, he fought in the this is where I'm not, my history, I'm again not speaking to Ukrainian history, but he fought in 2014, 2015 in the Revolution of Dignitary, and he defended his home then, and he was a combat medic then, and he was processing, when he wrote this in the years in between, he was processing a lot of those feelings of seeing people killed, of seeing people threatened. And his response to it isn't grim. His response to it is, hey, remember, he probably wouldn't be like, are you making my book say hey? But that's what I do. Americans make your book say hey. It says, hey, we're cool, we're beautiful, everything about us is important, and our little daily interactions, and this is it's a reminder to me, this is the joy that we are defending, fighting for, hoping for, whatever role we have in the world. Everyone is threatened in different ways, our joy. And to me, it was such a non-toxic positivity, because I'm not for that, reminder of the joy that is important, that we're actually fighting for, and why we tell stories. And I just thought it did all those things so well. And I found the biggest emotion I had was anger. I just kept becoming angry, and it sounds obvious, but I didn't expect to be as angry when I read this, because I just was like, this is a first novel. This poet, this person was 29 years old. Why isn't he here? Why can't he write more of these stories? And I just got mad, and it made me even more glad that we were able to take this project on. And I should say, with the help of the Ukrainian Book Institute, which has provided a grant for this. And it just, but we do have these words, we do have this perspective, and there have been many stories told over time, and there will continue to be many stories told over time. But this is sort of in a unique place, this pause in between these two invasions, and this person who wrote a novel but was at his heart a poet, who did not see himself as so much of a novelist, but this was something precious to him. And so, yeah, I'm glad that you enjoyed it for those reasons. And I don't know if there's anything in that you wanted to add.
Oh no, I mean, I think everything you said makes perfect sense. And what I was thinking about, and what I meant in part by referring to it as reading like magic realism, was not in the sense of all kinds of fizzy, fireworky, magical things happening, but in the concentration on people and the everyday. And one of the things that is most telling and engaging about this book is it's also a paean to resilience, which obviously is very much on the minds of, I'm sure, everybody in the Ukraine at the moment, or in Ukraine at the moment. And but there's also and this is, I'm sure there are a lot of people involved in the Russian side of that whole thing who are also like wishing it hadn't started and wishing there was a way out of it. And one of the interesting things about it, from my point of view, is there's an entire kind of what at first appears to be a sort of, excuse the broad generalization, but a kind of Eastern European fatalism to it, that anybody who, went through the Cold War era like I did, and heard the kind of jokes they used to tell in the Soviet Union and the occupied countries like Ukraine, knows that there is a kind of deep, cynical, Eastern European way of dealing with this, because they've been going through so many different kinds of unwanted governments being thrust on them for so long. But that in this particular book, the subtle message, well, it's not even that subtle, really. The message that kind of seeps out all over the place is of resilience, is of, we will get through this because that's what we always do. And that to me feels very Eastern European. It's a particular thing of, first of all, sort of almost enjoying the fact that we're the ones who always get screwed, that kind of feeling of like, oh, big surprise, we're getting messed over again, which, if you live in the Balkans or anywhere like that, I'm sure that, your family history goes back hundreds of years of people messing with you in one shape or form. But there's also that deep kind of cynical humor too, of like, yeah, of course it's bad, and it'll get better again, and then it'll get bad again, and that's all right. We'll by staying small in our aims and our goals, we will get through to the next good patch, and that I thought ran all through the book, and especially at the ending, when things begin to change in a long-term way, change for good or change for, and a lot of the characters then begin, or they begin their next arc in life, or whatever the case may be. that that resilience becomes something where you go, oh, okay, I see how it works now. It's like on the one hand, those who lost something are mourning it, but on the other hand, they've lost things before. And they're also aware that you don't get anywhere by sitting around and just mourning. You have to then get up and trudge forward, and eventually things will start to happen again. So that kind of, I don't like the word fatalism because that always sounds like you're talking about something that can't be fixed that's happening. But I will call it a sort of cynicism. There is a kind of an Eastern European cynicism to the book that I loved, where all the characters are kind of like, they're all fencing with these problems and these issues and these philosophical weights on their shoulders, but most of them also are kind of busily squirreling away resources and working toward making things better and all of that stuff. And for that reason, if not for many others, and there are many others, I found it a very hopeful book. And I know exactly what you mean. It's almost like it was written as almost like a prayer, like we're gonna get through this, but you have to prepare yourself for whatever bad happens. But then remember, like the sun does come back eventually. And not coincidentally, there's a huge amount of weather that runs through this book, and the cycles of the seasons, and specifically cold and warmth are very strong motifs that run through the whole book. And they are not, I don't think, necessarily in themselves something that maybe you could. I didn't have time to read it carefully enough to like literally break down all the weather scenes and decide if they were all significant, but they certainly are part of the changeability of the world, and we hope the inevitability of some kind of happiness, just as every year the cold ends and every year the sun comes back, and that is something that the people in this story, that goes back thousands of years for them, for the people who live in the country, the people who deal with the day-to-day tasks. So that kind of constant checking and informing the reader about, what the weather is like is another way that I found really interesting of showing you how things seem to change and oscillate deeply and powerfully in a day-to-day sense, but that if you step back from it, you will see that there are patterns, and the patterns are of ending and beginning, and ending and beginning. It's a continuous cycle, and it always comes back around. So you can't say we're done with the bad stuff forever, but in the same way, you never say the bad stuff will never end, and that also seems to inform the book very deeply. The idea of the cyclical nature of both the world we live in, but also the things that we bear, the fears that we have, the outside forces that attempt to destroy our happiness. And I see all of that in the book. And that was another thing that I kept noticing. And I finally went, okay, he's doing this for a reason. He's not, by the time I was like a quarter of the way into the book, it was like, okay, he's trying to tell me something here. And that was what you just heard was my interpretation of it.
That is fascinating. I'm just sitting here like, I have to remember that I'm live on YouTube because I'm like, tell me more about it. This is great.
Well, one of the really nice things about any good book, and especially any good, ambitious work of fiction, is that a gifted writer of any kind, and Mishak is certainly that, will try, or Mishak, what will try to not point you directly at something and say, this is what's behind my metaphor, but they will give you clouds of information, and you can sift out what at any one time is what you're most interested in pursuing. And so there was a point at which I went, what is he doing with the weather stuff? And there are other points where I said, what does the happiness machine represent? And there are other points I went where I said, wow, he's really talking a lot about how they're rebuilding this factory, which has been allowed to fall apart. And what exactly are they going to do here? Because you don't really find out for a while. Yeah. So there's a
Or
number of
why.
ways. Yeah, exactly. And there's a number of ways, except again, that resilience, that
Mhm.
like, here's something that's not being used. If we don't use it, someone else will. And the implication being in a state where the order has fallen apart a bit, it may be criminals that will use it. So some rather more decent people might as well. And that is in the story as well. But there's just a number of things like that where you can take any single aspect of it and pull it out and look at it and kind of get a feeling for why the writer might have decided to make that a thematic piece of the story. And like me, you may be wrong. But the fact is that any good book is going to make you think about these things, and whether they're exactly what the writer intended or whether the writer themselves knew everything that she or he were going to write and why is not the issue. Any piece of art, the issue is what it makes you feel and think. And believe me, there's just plenty of stuff in the factory to chew on. I mentioned the chewy bits. There's plenty to chew on here. And if we weren't trying to not spoil it too much, we could go into detail on a whole lot of things, because there are a lot of.
So yeah, there's so much in it. And actually, I'm loving listening because you're clarifying for me some things that I had thought about but not fully, this is why I bring in an expert that I had not fully thought about. But what I think this dichotomy you're describing of, we're not calling it fatalism, but the resilience, but also the hope and the joy at the same time, sort of understanding the weight of the pragmatic weight, but not letting it be everything.
Hmm.
I found the way I processed that was kind of like seeing that in the very first line of the book, which I love the first line of the book, which is nothing will happen if you do nothing. And I love that line because it seems a little simple on the surface,
Hmm.
um, but it's also equally true and not true. It sounds like a call to action, like, well, you have to do something, but it's not true that nothing will happen if you do nothing. This is a man who actively left his job, left his beloved wife, and went to defend his home. He did something, and but he knew that if he did nothing, that things would continue to happen. That and I just love that line because it says all of that at once. And that was to me that first line. I just like, oh, there's so much in that.
Well, it raises a question too, which is the closest thing one can imagine to what he was saying there was that if nothing is done, nothing good will happen. But he did not put that word in there, and I don't believe that he was deliberately leaving it out. I mean, I know I do believe he was deliberately leaving it
Right.
out. I don't believe he was deliberately, making that super broad statement. I think he wanted people to engage with it just the way that you're telling, and obviously the truth of his story and the fact that he did do his best to do something and it cost him his life is not a minor note here. This is not a biographical, like, oh, well, because he loved his little chair when he was a child, that's probably why he became this or that. It's not that kind of a biographical detail. This is literally the emotional and other, physical, real important choice that he had to make in his life, and he made it. And for him, it ended in his death, tragically. And for his family, his wife, others, it ended in all kinds of sadness and upset. But also running through the book is none of these characters, who are all, as you said, Emily, they're all kind of, quirky and not always immediately lovable or
Yeah.
whatever, but none of these characters, you get the feeling, would have made it through this story, at least not in a healthy, happy way, without the other characters. So it's also very much a book about, look, if I fall by the wayside, others will get through. And so my sacrifice or my loss of my future and my family's loss of me and all that means will not be completely meaningless. I will have done something to help others not to have to go through this. And at a time when all of us are worried about politics and about a lot of other things, that's a key fact. And I'm not by any means suggesting that you all should run out and martyr yourselves for a cause. But the idea that there are bigger things than any one of us and that only the individual matters is a not only kind of an unpleasant and unhealthy way to think about things, but it's also manifestly untrue. And the book kind of, that's one of the thematic things that comes through. We are social animals. We are social animals. We live in groups. We make family units. We generally, stay in those family units in some shape or form. We have, as a matter of fact, our biggest political disagreements come down to where do you draw the line between your people and other people, right? Which is an age-old human question, and we even have arguments about it in biology and stuff. How many humans can you actually know, and those kinds of things that are always being discussed. But in the book, I noticed that pretty much every character at some point is sort of picked up off the ground or heartened at a moment of extreme despair, or simply something you said. They get together and they have a party, and whether that party is, just roasting some meat over a fire together and having a drink, or, it's a wedding or it's a funeral or whatever it is, and the, kind of wake that goes with it, it is what's the word I'm looking for? It's a reinforcement of the idea that none of us is alone. And that as long as we stay in touch with other people, there's a chance that something better will be ahead. Not necessarily for every individual, because, the author knows that it's a risk to try to keep going and to do the right thing. But as a group, if we do these things and we do the brave things, then we have a much better chance to make it through whatever it is that is concerning us now.
Yeah, I agree with everything. And to reinforce, I know you're saying this, but when you're talking about, he wanted to come back. He wanted, and I know you're saying the same thing. He wanted to survive.
Right.
But he knew because he had seen it before that he knew the possibility. And so he's saying both things at once. He's saying, I want to come back. I want to sit by the lake. I want to do sports. I want to, you know, have a beer. And
Yeah.
yet he's also saying, but I'm doing this thing because we are not individuals. We are individuals, but we are not only individuals.
Right.
We
Yeah.
are, and it's interesting because I talked to Joyce Chung in Singapore last week actually about the re-release of her book Fireheart, and we were having some of these same conversations, talking about. She kept talking about we're all mushrooms, the mushroom story writers. I'm not
Right.
cool enough to be a mushroom story writer, but of our interconnections, I like to say quiet fantasy because that's my version of mushroom. That's how I
I
describe the
like that.
mushrooms. Yeah, and that's what people. I actually have I have an essay coming up. I'm not trying to plug it, but I have an essay coming up about quiet fiction and what it means and what it doesn't mean to me. And I think that I say this in the essay, but it's really important, I think, to have those conversations, because talking about ourselves, our feelings, and our connections to other people, as you have on, your readings every week, that is something that they're trying to not have us do. The oppressors. There are people that don't want us to have those honest conversations. They don't want us to remember our power together, our joy together, our communities. You sign off, actually, a way that I have generally signed off too, and some of my best friends, which is, take care of yourself and each other, is a common refrain among people who write this type of work and think in those terms of storytelling as a way to remind people and like you said, not in an on the nose way, just through these stories, because I think sometimes the stories stick with us more than, the imagery sticks with us more than a straight up reminder. Hey, remember you're not alone. Okay, fine. Could
Yeah.
be a platitude, but when you read it, when you think about it, when it exercises your empathy, as a reader, it can stick with you more. I would, if you'd like, I actually would like to talk just a little bit about, because you're someone that, has traveled the world, is translated in many languages and places, and is, familiar with, I don't want to say like you've been around a long time. I know you're having to deal now with the people that said, oh, Ted Williams, I love you. I read your book. I read your last book when I was 2 years old. And you're like, yeah, okay. So I'm not trying to say that, of
That's
course.
not the worst part. The worst part is like, I didn't know you were still alive.
That's the worst.
Yeah.
I'm only laughing because I can just imagine. I know that people actually say that. That's why it's funny. And
Oh,
I'm
I
like,
know. I
oh,
know.
people.
Yeah.
But something that, we have a very tiny small press. I am like here in my little, it's technically called a bungalow. You can look it up in Ferndale, a Michigan bungalow. Chris is literally on the other side of this old 1920s hallway, hopefully making sure everything's going smoothly and that we're broadcasting and all these things. And yet we have somehow found, well, I know how, but again, long stories. We have become sort of a global publisher. We're currently publishing, work in Ghana and in Ukraine and in Singapore, and we pub we love Canadians. I can tell you that we have so many Canadian friends. This is just me bragging about all of my Canadian friends. Sorry, I didn't mean to go into that.
No, no, no.
No,
And
that was a Canada joke. I'm sorry.
I'm
Um,
very impressed because you're doing something, and that's always better than not doing something. And I say, good for you. Yeah.
but my point in that is that I have, as somebody that, so I am not like traditionally educated as a literary person. I'm one of those, it isn't, I'm not alone in this. People that came to fantasy through a combination of engineering degrees and mental illness. That's not actually that rare. Not that rare. But I did not take a lot of literature and I didn't study English. I studied other languages and I took a lot of technical classes, but I don't have that traditional education. And so I grew up kind of thinking there's fantasy and there's science fiction and there's, these things. And I have so quickly learned, you talked about, magical realism and its place in a certain part of the world. And there's also what I've learned, we didn't know what to call embroidered worlds at first because um, is it a speculative fiction anthology? And what we learned is that's not how Ukrainians think of it. There is science fiction, but they don't. It's the term that we ended up using was fantastic fiction. So not fantasy, but
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Because to them, fantastic fiction is also technical stories, science stories, space
Sure.
stories.
Yeah.
And I've learned a lot about African storytelling. And yes, Africa is a very big place, but a lot of the efforts that are going on now actually are kind of this merging of different cultures. So they are sort of, more than one specific traditional
Sure.
culture. And in a lot of those cultures, time is not linear. It is a circle. Technology is in the past. The ancestors and the connection and all these things come together. And I guess I'm learning that most places in the world have very much not a concept of fantasy and science fiction and horror and paranormal.
Mhm.
It's just not how it is. Very much, the colonial way of thinking. Put it in bins and put it on the right shelf, and it removes a lot of the humanity, a lot of the spirituality, a lot of the cultural authenticity of these places. And so that's one thing that I love hearing you talk about, like with the factory, but in general, this concept that people are writing things that are not, that are taking storytelling and in its fantastic elements or in its visions of the future or in its ties to the past. And I think there's just I don't know what the question is. I'm sure you'll have something to say on this, but that idea of even why people need to read more global fiction, it's not just for different perspectives or, make sure I there's been a lot of bristling online with people sort of treating it like, eating your veggies. Now, I'm
Mhm.
vegan, so I like veggies, but, you know, you don't read
I
global
know
fiction.
exactly what you mean.
But it's
You
not a
should
chore.
be
It's not
reading.
yeah, you go read some diverse. That's not it. That's insulting. It's good stuff, and it's not a chore. But it's also, I think there are elements to global fiction that are pulling us out of these things we were taught. Some of us. I
Well,
grew up in a much more conservative small town than I know you did.
I think everything you're saying is valid and true. The only thing I would toss into the thing is, this is a pet subject of mine, is that a lot of a lot of what you referred to offhandedly as colonial fiction approach is in fact market driven. And one of the things that has happened, as both the popularity of what used to be called science fiction, which used to include things like the Lord of the Rings. I mean, that was, back at an earlier stage, science fiction rose as a separator, as a delineation between types of fiction. And there wasn't enough fantasy written because most of it was written by wealthy retired English guys. There wasn't a huge amount of it before Tolkien blew the market open. So then they kind of added on the category of fantasy. And then for a while anyway, that became the dominant economic thing in that part of the genre stroke subgenre. But a lot of it is, so it all this stuff was very general. I mean, in the old days, what the kind of stories that Homer was telling in the Iliad, whoever Homer actually was, or more especially in the Odyssey, were just stories. They were stories that were current at the time. They were myths, they were folk tales, and they were no different than stories about real heroes that people knew had lived, and probably not a whole lot less trustworthy either than the sort of hagiographic stuff written about military heroes. But what happens is those things gradually moved into a situation where they actually became financially valuable, as a market. And at that point, the corporate folks stepped in and began to say, why should we do things that it isn't clear who wants to buy them? We should push the writers and we should push the salespeople into directing these things down a particularly narrow tube so that they go right to the people who want them. And there's no worrying. They go, oh, it's got a dragon on it. And it's from such and such a publishing company. This will be what I want. And unfortunately, I mean, there's a good side in that everybody gets access to the things they like. And if there's enough draw for it, then there's a lot of writers writing that kind of stuff. But what that also means is that the boundaries between types of fiction and between fiction and nonfiction, all these things just get higher and higher and heavier and thicker until, eventually they become pipes. They're not just walls or boundaries anymore. They're pipes, and people are being given stuff down the pipe by the people on the other end. And it's much harder to branch out of that because you've gotten used to not having to struggle to understand something or not having to try and parse the cultural differences or whatever. So what's true for fantasy and science fiction, which is, they've become more specialized and market driven, is even more true with something like The Factory or anything that is kind of indeterminate in where it fits. Also, we didn't get a chance to mention this before, but I know this from my personal experience with lots of writing friends in Europe, say, for instance, that there is also a huge rushing current from the English speaking world into the English as a second language speaking world. So when it comes to publishing books, somebody like us, for whom English is our first language, we are essentially jumping on the water slide at the top, and then the water is carrying us down. And if we're lucky, it's carrying us to new audiences. Whereas people like Mashak and others, and many friends of mine overseas are having to, if they want to get something published outside their own language, they're going to have to break into the English language market in most cases. And that is swimming up the water slide. I mean, it's a lot difficult. There's a reason that those salmon all look so damn tired all the time. It's not an easy
I thought
thing.
it was all the spawning or anyway.
Well, I think that helps later on, but it's like first they're exhausted, then they spawn, then they die. So,
Okay, right.
that's the process. But I mean, no, I've talked to writer friends of mine back when I first started traveling a lot in Europe, and they would all say, I'd say, hey, I'd love to read something of yours. And they'd say, well, you better learn Dutch, or you better learn Italian, or you better learn, because it's not in English. And so that's another factor as well. There's a kind of, with any foreign book, let alone whether it fits easily into a market or not, there's also that pressure of the current. So that's one of the reasons I'm really pleased to see what you've been doing and what you're doing and trying to bring these to new markets, because you're absolutely right. There is huge value to be had. And again, because it's kind of obvious, you brushed past the cultural differences. But in fact, what's always really important to me is that only in fiction or actually meeting people and talking to them, in which case most of the time they have to, unless they speak Spanish or French, they have to speak my language. Those are the two languages I can have a conversation in outside English. But for most people, I can't glimpse what their world is really like, and writing is specifically one of the places where that can be done, where you can read something, you can read a novel by Chinua Achebe or somebody like that, African writer, very fine African writer, and at least glimpse. Nobody should ever be arrogant enough to think they can understand another culture from reading one book. Because like if somebody was going to do that with American culture, what one book would do that for them? God
that's
knows.
a terrifying thought, actually.
Yeah, exactly. But at least you can get a glimpse that you didn't have before, and you can make a little adjustment, a little alteration. And the more information you get, the more alterations you can make until you begin to have at least the beginnings of a grasp on another culture. And yes, it's work in a sense, but it's also astounding. I mean, how are we going to ever greet aliens if we can't even understand other people that live on the same planet? It's crucial that we learn to communicate across political lines, across language lines, across geographic lines. I don't want to sound unduly utopian or Star Trek-ish about this, but we're going to have to learn how to govern ourselves as a species eventually. The whole nationalism thing is so arbitrary, and it was based on so much theft and rapine early on. We're eventually going to have to find out a way, if we don't want the crises that are going to be coming in the next 100 years to overwhelm us. One of the ways we're going to have to do that is to make sure that we all have equal protection from life's mischances and from cruelty and theft and murder and all that stuff, which means that the people living in Afghanistan have to have the same protections in place as the people living in England or Canada or America. That's a long way away. You don't even want to start talking about that stuff because it gets all the, I ain't having no damn one world government people.
People get fussy, that's for sure. I have learned that myself.
Yeah.
But this is another thing that they get fussy about. And I'm not getting too spicy, but I'll say it, is the stories. This is why I sort of roughly said colonial, and I think we'll be in agreement on this. But for people listening, this might be interesting. The stories. How do I say this? The stories of the people that won those arbitrary border disputes, and made the nations,
right,
tend not to be the stories that are going to teach us how to live as one species on a planet. So, because they were the ones that went in and did the conquering. So, it's like, how do we, there are, many of them have been significantly marginalized and dampened, but there are various, lots, a wealth of indigenous cultures and storytelling forms and ways of looking at things that are about care and kindness and oneness, and looking out for each other, looking out for, the people who are emotionally sensitive, who have disorders, looking for the queer people, people of multiple genders, saying this is not somebody I'm worried about. This is somebody who is extra blessed, beautiful. And so I think that the answer to you don't ever apologize for Star Trek in my presence, is what I have to say.
It wasn't the Star Trek per se. It was that the optimistic side of Gene Roddenberry's vision of a galactic government that was actually.
I could talk Data and Geordi. I know I'm a little younger, but I could talk Data and Geordi all day. It's okay. That's not what we're here to do.
I'm here for it. But I wasn't apologizing for Star Trek. I was just saying that I didn't want to think I was jumping right to however many thousand years in the future when we have a utopia kind of thing. Yeah. Obviously, we've got to deal with what's on this. But how do we get? I guess I'm agree. How do we get there? One way to start moving in that direction is the storytelling of the people who are not, conquery in nature. Absolutely.
Right. So,
and the resilience, again, to come back to the factory, that resilience of, look, we human beings make a lot of mistakes. Some of us are probably not very nice people for whatever reasons, but as a group, we keep getting up. It's like the Chumbawamba song, we get knocked down and we get up, and that's what we do. And while I am just as worried as anybody is about all the problems that are around us at the moment, I'm also somebody who's been around long enough now and reads enough history to know that history bends, if not toward justice, it bends toward, I think, survival and It's only when things are really, really desperate that survival becomes stripped down of any meaning except literal survival. But most of the rest of the time, that means surviving in something resembling happiness or something resembling security. And I think that the arc of history does bend toward humans going on, getting better, getting smarter, protecting those who can't protect themselves, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not a pessimist in the way that some people I know are. I am more of a believer that, let's not give up on the human race quite yet. We've made it a long way so far. And I think there's a future, a fascinating future ahead of us. And in fact, one of the things I'm personally most bitter about, this book was bringing up thoughts like that for me. One of the things I'm most personally bitter about is that, I probably won't be around to see a lot of the next generation of scientific discoveries that are going to happen 50 years from now or 60 years from now that, I really want to know about. It's not that I want to perpetuate myself. It's that, I'm fascinated by what humanity will discover and do. That's what I'd like to. So I'd be happy to just get frozen or something and pop out every 50 or 100 years or so just to check in.
Okay, so that's
I have one other thing.
I just wrote like 20 story prompts in my mind because you say your essay on the stone and what could it be? My story seed right now is the metering and how long does frozen Tad Williams emerge each time, like, and what religion forms around like the cicadas.
Yeah, what do the Tadists believe?
Yeah, like
Mostly
does it span lifetimes? Because we have to preserve you because you already went a little too long before the freezing, so we don't have like infinite years.
That is definitely true. Yeah, I should
tell our grandchildren when you are about my age, you will witness the next return of Tad.
I should have opted for the intravenous Freon about 30 years ago or so, but hey, can't do it now.
You don't always want the first version though.
Well, that's probably
wait for the trials. Let
that's
somebody
right. The one who's had enough rough landings. That now, one other book I wanted to mention that is seemingly completely unrelated, but it actually there's a lot of stuff that it brought to mind for me that came back up when I was reading The Factory. And it's a book called The Great War and Modern Memory by Paul Fussell or Fussell or Fussell. I've never known how it was pronounced. It's Fussell, like Russell with an F. And it's a book about how the people who fought the First World War wrote about it. And a lot of it is letters, but they're also talking about the famous books that were written, like All Quiet on the Western Front and Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, and a lot of other famous World War I books. But the reason it comes to mind is because the most fascinating bits are the ones from the people who are very much like Ihor Maishak himself, that the ones who did not come back, but that to get to see how they were thinking about this hideous dilemma that they were in and what was important to them and what they wanted most. And, it was all this very human stuff, despite the fact that some of these people like Siegfried Sassoon and others were actually poets and wrote beautifully. But the things that they were poetically missing in most cases, or poetically hoping to see again someday, were the most everyday sort of things. They were sitting in these god awful trenches, in France or wherever. And they weren't thinking about, the day we win the war or, the parades or no, they were thinking about like, a proper cup of tea instead of the swill that we're getting, or just to sit on the lawn and watch people playing a game or, these kinds of things. And that very definitely runs through The Factory, as we've been talking about, this momentary refuge from life's dilemmas and life's frustrations and life's unanswered questions, many of which will never be answered. That's just a permanent ignorance that we humans will live with. And so I saw a lot of that. And I hadn't thought about it that deeply until you mentioned that idea of the social stuff. But then I went, yeah, that is a strong theme. And it is about what is human in us. What happens when we stop thinking about the future and go, hell, it's a party. There's food, there's drinks, there's, what it is that they say at the wedding, like, well, it's not a real wedding unless someone gets in a fight. And it's clearly what they're saying is that, you know, these kinds of social occasions bring out every kind of human behavior. But they're not saying we want to see somebody get hurt. They're saying we want to see people acting like stupid humans, because that's part of this whole thing. And in fact, there is a fight. This isn't a big spoiler. There is a fight. It's inconsequential largely in the story. It's just kind of like, so they did have their fight after all, you know, and you know,
Yeah, and
nobody was permanently
I
crippled
can't
or
speak
anything.
for him, but I just feel very confident that that's exactly what he was thinking about writing that.
I would think so. And it's again, it's this constant turning back to the really simple things of community and but also trying to protect your own patch, you know, and not but not necessarily cheat anybody else, but just that you also have to remember not everybody is going to look out for me as well as I'll look out for myself. So you see that with his friend. I've just gone blank on his name. Starts with a B. The one who he plays soccer with, that Water plays soccer with.
Yeah,
Uh,
I just blinked on it too.
no, it starts to start with a D. Anyway, it'll
Oh,
come to me in a moment. But it's his friend that and then it's his friend whose marriage, whose wedding he goes to.
yeah,
He and Water play soccer together on the same team, and his name is
not boss.
yeah, it is Boss.
Boss, yeah.
It is Boss. Sorry.
I
Yeah, I
love
knew
the
he had it.
names in this book. There's Water and Boss and Uncle Vasil, who is an
Yeah,
uncle for some reason. Like
exactly.
it's and so I did one reading of this and I was a little nervous because it's not like a snappy, pick a quote kind of book. It's not like
Mm.
it's this exciting little scene. And I was really pleasantly surprised. Now this was at the fantasy convention, so okay, admittedly, but people really resonated with it. And one I read was where Water is listening to the radio, and this was sort of the other side of what you were saying in terms of those normal life. Can we just be people?
Uh,
The fact that how much, and this is a little darker element of it, but there was such a military concept there that he's in the factory. He's not, it's a metaphor, but
right.
he's just listening to the radio and thinking about how somebody's stuck in traffic and children are getting cold waiting for their ride, and just this whole life is happening somewhere else, that he's all the best he can do is listen about it and imagine it. But there was such joy in saying, wow, I wish, there was, it didn't say this, but I wish I were out there watching cold kids on the sidewalk. That's real life.
Hmm.
And dad's late with the car. That's
Yeah.
just us living. And
Although, well, go ahead and read it. And then I
no, no,
actually, all I wanted to add to that is,
go ahead.
but in a sense, that also underlines the point we were making earlier, which is that in a sense, he is connecting. And that's one of the things that he really values about having the radio is like suddenly he's back in the world. He's experiencing people talking about things and it leading him to imagine what those things are. And so in a sense, it's also kind of another not magical, but it's another device that allows him to be more human. You know, reminds him that you're not alone. There is that community out there with people who are much like you. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say
No,
about
no,
it.
that's really all I was saying about it too, is that it, but I guess one thing I will note just for some of the people listening is, this is Athos Arts. We're known to be uh, whatever we are. I mean, we have lots of feminist writing, lots of queer writing, lots of progressive writing. We are certainly not someone who doesn't know about the existence of women. And yet but I think that might surprise people when they read this, that it's just like all men, and the women in it are,
They're
I
all
think,
named Oksana for one
they're all,
thing.
yeah, there's jokes about Oksana, and they're also treated, I would say very dismissively.
Mm,
Um, very peripherally, not with a lot of sort of, they're all in the peripheral. And to me that was, people say, why would you, to me that was all extraordinarily intentional in this sort of military metaphor. And yes, there's obviously women, in Ukraine that are fighting and defending, but you can imagine in whatever, unit he's in, he suddenly, now he has this, wonderful, kind, loving wife, and now he's not with her, and he's with these kind of weird guys. I'm not saying anyone was weird, but these people that got pulled from all these different places with these
right.
strange different backgrounds, and they're all like a little bit, angsty, as I would put it. And just the metaphor of all that in the context of what is finding the joy and not the joy. There's just so many metaphors. And I guess I'll say this because I haven't said this yet. I love that very much military metaphors throughout the whole book, deeply military metaphors, but I do not take any of them as jingoistic.
Mm,
I did not read any of that, which is, I've talked to, I won't name their names, but I've talked to people who have published a lot of, read and published a lot of like Russian fiction. And again, we understand that people in different countries are all humans and that's not,
sure.
but culturally and what gets published, because you mentioned the industry decides what gets published in Russia, that clearly would involve the government.
Yeah.
Russian science fiction is very, very jingoistic, very, many people have told it very much military power and might. And to me, that's a really interesting example is reading this Ukrainian book by somebody that you might think, well, he's off again to the military, he cares, it, it, it really reads with so much melancholy, but like you said, also with that joy.
Hmm.
I'm here, but anyway, I
It's a
think,
very, yeah, I hear, no, absolutely. It's a very humanist book. It definitely, and the fact that there is no conversation about anything specific in the way of enemies except for the possibly criminal guys that show up initially who kind of also want to claim the factory, but even they are not even given names, so they are just kind of like another force of nature. It's like in a country that is in flux and has having problems, there will always be people like that who have their own
and
organizations.
Yuri, doesn't Yuri have kind of an ethically suspect brother that like, there's
Yeah,
kind of this external
he does. And there's
forces.
a kind of an admission within it because a couple of people actually in it, because I think also, um, yeah, the guy we were just talking about, who boss also mentioned something about like, well, I might have done this back in the old days, but I'm doing this one legitimately. And there's a lot of that kind of thing. And of course, that's also part of that Eastern European kind of, to me anyway, that sort of cultural generalization I have in my mind of like, look, don't judge. I'm doing what I have to do
Yeah.
to make it, and to provide. And interestingly enough, I think that you mentioned the lack of women characters or female characters, and they are very kind of sparse on the ground in this book. Although they are important when they do show up, but they're and sometimes not in the same way you expected. But I think part of that may also be, and I'm just guessing here, that there is this kind of, especially in more traditional societies, there is this kind of idea that, well, men have to do things, men have to go out and make things happen, and that whether that's always a good idea or not is certainly one of the things that's being questioned in the book. Whether these plans, ideas, determined, sorties into various areas, are actually a good idea, that's debatable. But there is this kind of male thing that runs through it all of like, well, I have to make something of myself. I have to do this. I need to, I've got to go off on my own. I shouldn't be, there's that whole kind of thing. And he may be using that. I don't know. He may be
Yeah.
using that as a way to examine some of these parts of the male culture in Ukraine that I don't know about. So
Yeah,
I'm
and that's
hesitant to.
my understanding is that's probably actually kind of edgy for the literature, and because that's what I got that too, and I got that a lot of, you know, none of the characters. I mean, I don't want to say they're not masculine, but they're all they're all like you said they measure them. I hadn't thought of that. They measure themselves constantly,
Mm,
constantly measure themselves, but also sort of somewhat ineptly, and
yeah.
you know,
Well, that's why. No, they're not there. It's definitely not being offered as like, see, this is why
yeah,
men should be running things. It's more like in this society, these are all guys who are out trying to find their place or to make something or to whatever. And their culture gives them that feeling that they need to do it. And that if they don't make it work, they're going to be failures, and that will bring all kinds of negative things. So that's definitely there. And again, I don't know contemporary Ukrainian society at all, so I'm hesitant to do anything other than say this is a guess on my part.
yeah,
And
and I
again,
don't
it's
either. But I have been told that this is by Ukrainians. This is a quote very Ukrainian book, is what they tell me.
I'm
So
sure.
we're so before we kind of, I hope that we've given people reasons to read this. Actually, it sounds like we
I hope
have,
so too. It's
but
definitely worth it.
I barely glanced over at YouTube because I've been having so much fun chatting, and I keep having to remind myself that I'm actually on. This is not a joke because You should join Tad for readings, on different there's a beautiful little community and we have so much fun, but I'm not actually on the screen. So I'm sitting here watching you in that room or in, things over the
Yeah,
last
same room,
yeah,
same
as it's gone
unfinished
through
downstairs office. Yeah.
different iterations and such. But and various cat visits and things like that.
Yeah.
But I have to, but I, so I'm just like, oh, I love listening to him talk about, fiction. Then I'm like, oh, wait, you're on the screen. I'm like, don't forget you're on the screen. But I did glance over, and here's my point, is I do know we have people on very, very late, though. I know he wouldn't appreciate me, mothering him in my speech in Germany right now. And I know we have people in Friday morning. Also, I saw we have a question, actually, I believe from Friday morning in Malaysia right now. So I was going to read that, and I would like your perspective on this.
Sure.
And it's in like negative or 0.001 font on my screen, and my eyes are not getting better, but I can do this. The question is, in your experiences, and it's for both of us, but I actually would like to hear you guys are, in your experiences working with publishing so it's aimed at me, but with but I think it applies. Publishing globally marginalized authors, what's worked in terms of encouraging them to not give up writing, telling, and sharing their authentic stories? And I think some of these people can reach out to me. So I would actually like to turn that into, you were talking about the pipes and the industry. And obviously there's no magic wand to say, oh, we're going to make the industry not so low risk driven or sales driven. That's not happening tomorrow either. That or, me getting to hang out with, Geordie LaForge. None of those things are happening in the near future. But in terms of pipes, when you have people that are watching this, and they will be on the video truly from around the world, and people who may not be necessarily writing primarily in English, how do they not give up? How would you speak to them about, where their place is?
Well, the thing is that as frustrating as it must be for people writing in languages other than English and hoping to reach a wide audience, I think it's certainly better now than it was, just because we have so many more tools of communication. We have so many more tools of interaction. Excuse me. We have so many more ways of hearing about things, because the only way that you are going to get books translated is by either an editor or a publisher falling in love with it, which means first they have to find it, or it has to get to them somehow, or other people around the world finding it who can read that language and then pushing it so hard that it begins to ripple out. And this of course does happen. That's why books like A Suitable Boy and well, not A Suitable Boy, but like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and stuff like that got out of their original language, was because enough people had bought it in that language that some publishers went, oh, because let's face it, I mean, one of the things that has changed in publishing is there's far less sort of noblesse oblige publishing than there used to be, because a lot of people used to go into publishing because it was respectable, even for well-to-do people. And as a result, they could afford to have favorites that they were pushing, that they felt deserved to be seen and read and things like that. That's not happening as much anymore. But the fact is, there are more places that you can take things, and there are more eyes available to see things now. I mean, back when I was starting out, now admittedly leaving the whole English issue out of it, but for instance, there were like 3 publishers that were publishing science fiction regularly, and only one of them, I think, was still accepting, or 2 of them were accepting over the transom books, meaning that they were not solicited to send that manuscript in. They were literally just dumped on them. So while on the one hand, that you're not as likely to have a publisher fall in love with your work, especially if it's not in English and you're looking for an English language publisher, but you are more likely to find other ways into the market, and that can start in your home market. So that's one thing, is don't say, oh, well, I'll probably never get into English, so therefore why bother? The idea is, whatever you're writing, work as hard as you can to make it work in your own language. And then if there's a chance it can go on, it's positioned in the best possible way. never hesitate to blow your own horn, to go out and engage people. Be respectful, be kind. Anytime somebody from the publishing industry is talking to you, they're giving you time, because it's not their job to go out all the time and go try and find obscure pieces of work. They've got jobs already. But if they do give you the time, and be polite about it, and use it in the best possible way. Even if they're not prepared at that moment to hear or to look at something of yours, let them remember you with fondness, so that when the opportunity arises again, they may say, oh yeah, I met so-and-so at a convention and such. Yeah, seemed like a real smart guy. Yeah, I'll check this out. So these are pretty much traditional things about getting publishing. But that's the main thing I would emphasize is don't be discouraged just because you write in a non-English language, but you are going to have to work in ways that English language writers don't have to work, but you can make it happen.
And I think a lot of the things you're saying are just as true if you are writing in English, but you're writing authentically to your storytelling and not necessarily in one of those, did you call them the tubes or the pipes
Yeah.
or whatever they were? Yeah.
Well, they started as boundaries, and then after a while they roofed them over and they became tubes to
And
deliver.
then that's another topic is how much to change. But I actually think that there's people that I think a lot of people get it wrong talking about short fiction, because there's a lot of people that talk about short fiction as though, dismissively. And it's not like, oh, you like a gateway. And that's not, I get very annoyed, because I find all forms of writing, long to short to be and to micro, to be very different and very valid. And, there's no such thing. But this was where I say, but there are just more, if you are writing in English, there are more opportunities for short stories, because there are more volume of them. There's more chances.
Mm-hmm.
Most publishers aren't publishing as many novels, and a lot of the indie publishers are short fiction based. So I would also say for those, keep trying. I'm too stubborn. The big editors tell me, they're like, I really like this piece, but I'm always kind of a little too Emily, which is probably why I made a press. But I'm there's an editor out there that knows I'm coming for that magazine and knows that I've got another effort in them. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it this
I
time.
just I just hope you save "A Little Too Emily" as a title for your, I don't know, autobiography or something. It's a good one.
Thank you. I will remember that. You know, uh, I actually will. That's really actually kind of great. I'm spinning on that now. But yeah, so we'll see if this time at that magazine, if I get through, I'm going to try to be a little less stubborn, just a little.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would encourage people out there to, try the short fiction markets again, not because you not because it's like, easier, so that's not what it is. But there are just by the bulk more opportunities, and more of those opportunities are indie opportunities. And then it's like what Tad said, people remember you, they remember that was a good story, or they remember working with you, or they say, yeah, I worked with her on a short story, or with him, with them. It was very pleasant. Um, and
Yeah,
I do,
even if you get rejected, if they make a suggestion or say, I did feel you needed to work a little bit on your characterization or something, you know, tell them, thank you, I will work on that. Just anything to leave a memory in the mind of somebody who might help you later on, and realize that anything that they're telling you is a kindness. Because again, nobody has to do this with unsolicited fiction. Nobody has to give you feedback. If you get any feedback or any encouragement at all, by God, they're doing you a favor. And that does not mean I'm putting publishers and editors on some kind of pedestal. It just means it's how the world works. If somebody goes out of their, and any place you go to, I mean, this is how I make a lot of my decisions on what businesses that I will patronize. If I go into a place, the guy goes, I don't carry those, but the guy down the street does. I'm like, I'm coming back to you next time, right? Because you tried to help me and not just make a sale of something I didn't want, right? Anything like that. And publishers are the same way, and they will remember you kindly, or at least they won't remember you badly, because that's the other thing about publishing. And Emily, I know, knows the truth of this. It's a very small world, even now, even with the internet. It's a very small world, and the chances are that if you say, well, screw you, buddy, you don't know anything about fiction, because you get rejected, somewhere along the line, either that person or someone that they worked with is going to see your name on something and go, oh yeah, that guy was a jerk.
Mhm.
So,
And
just
writers
don't
talk
pee in your own
all the time.
bathwater.
Writer and editors and publishers talk all the time.
Absolutely.
There
And they
are
change
editor
companies.
groups, there are small press groups, and now that there's even discords and, emails, and yeah, it's very true. I've heard Cat Rambo say that over and over and over again, which is it's a very small business actually.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's on purpose. I have irritated people for reasons that I stand by, but you have to make sure you stand by those reasons as opposed to just, being a jerk and everybody remembers, hey, I
Yeah.
met that person. They're actually kind of a jerk.
Yeah,
And also,
absolutely.
I'm not going to do this live, and we're gonna wrap up. But I have someday, if I ever get to chat with you, not broadcasting. There are several people, one of whom is in the chat, that have told me the most lovely stories about you that you may not remember, of times you've interacted with them or times that you've helped them. So you're one of those. So if you don't know Tad Williams, he's one of those people that many out there, including in the chat right now, have had such pleasant interactions.
I'm
And
just glad they all got the checks in time to show up and give me
I,
those
I
positive
haven't
quotes.
I haven't got my check yet. I didn't. I
Well,
have I have
I'm
my
still
my
waiting.
map of Osten and I have.
You still got a couple minutes left. So I'm waiting to see how you do.
Well, here's my couple of minutes. Here's what I'm gonna do. This is gonna be exciting, and it's not the factory. I'm gonna make music like dun, 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 dun. I have to tell you that we were talking about, we're not going to go into the industry of fantasy and other things, but I will tell you that Tad does not write anything that his entire heart is not in, that every word is considered and loved, that he has friends that are reading it for the lore and the consistency and making sure every word is loved. And if I know some out there have heard of the original, it sounds original, but the earlier Osten books and Memory and Sorrow and Thorn, and have said, oh yeah, I read that, it was very good. I'm telling you, the next books, there's novels, and there's also a couple like bridge and prequel, are they're incredible. They're incredible. You should be reading them. I don't say things I don't mean. People know that. So read the factory, support small presses, but also, you need something meaty to get into. And this,
Yeah.
this is just,
And daddy's cats need new shoes. So,
they do. They do. So,
No, but I just
the good fancy California cat food, all of it.
I just wanted to second you on the factory. It is a book that will repay careful reading, but also just reading for fun. Also, help Emily and other editors like her find and support writers outside of your normal chain of experience, because that's how we all grow, is by hearing things we didn't know. And one of the best ways to do that is by reading fiction that comes from different places and different people. So, if anything in this conversation, it piqued your interest, go check out Emily's stuff, go find out where you can get a copy or send in for a copy or whatever, and make this your chance to try something you haven't tried before.
Well, thank you. And I will add, just because I said this on another chat too, and I'll say it here. I have told people that supporting is good, and cash money support is extra good. But we have stood by this from the very beginning. Any of our stories, if you want to read them, and if you have a financial issue, a safety issue, an access issue, any of it, reach out to me. I'm on my own DMs. I'm out there. I will get you a copy of the story. So supporting is good, but if you want to read it, we will find a way to get you the story. And Joyce Ching was on here too, and said the same thing about her books. Said, if you want to read it and it's difficult, we will get you a copy of the book. So
Nice.
um,
Nice.
so reach out anytime. Well, thank you again for doing this. This is really, I really appreciate it. I hope people enjoyed it. I'm glad I said nice things about Canada earlier, because I see that also Canadians have joined us. So we have people from, someone just actually posted that they are in the middle of reading The Navigator's Children now.
Nice. Well,
Reading.
I'm kind of an honorary Canadian, actually, because when I was about 19 or so, I lived with a Canadian family in California for pretty much a year, which is a long and complicated story, but I retained all kinds of interesting learning from that experience, like trying to get Canadians out of the house in October, even though you're in California and it's 75 degrees outside. They're like, no, time to play cards, time to play cards. It's almost winter. Like, it's like, it isn't this warm in the summer in southern Calgary. It's just, no time to play cards. So
I mean, look, I'm here in Michigan, So it's a bit of euchre culture up here too. So I
You
can't,
know what it's like. Yeah,
I can't,
yeah.
I can't, I'm like, yeah, sounds, it's October. What are you going out for?
Yeah, exactly. You'll
Anyway,
die out there, man. No.
I go
Anyway,
out
so
all the
no,
time because the
I'm
traffic's so
very
crazy.
fond of Canada. I have a
Well,
deep fond. They were from Saskatoon, so I will always, in my heart, have a fond place for Canada and especially for Saskatchewan.
yes, I have a friend there also, which I would love to go visit someday. All right. Well, thank you again for doing this. We're going to do the thing where we awkward, at least I'll be awkward. You'll be just regular Tad, but awkwardly sort of wave and smile. And then Chris will magically tell us that we are no longer on the air. So
Uh,
thank you to
Fair enough.
everybody for joining us. And I hope that you enjoyed this. And thank you, Tad. This was really,
Thank,
really fun.
thank you for inviting me.
I can't even imagine telling teenage Emily that this was happening. So, uh, you know, but I exist mostly in linear time, so that's what I can do. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Take care, everyone.